So my name is Leo Guardado. I'm an assistant professor in the theology department of Fordham University in New York City. So I was born in a rural village in the Department of Chalatenango in El Salvador in Central America. I grew up there till almost age 10, at which point my mother decided that we should leave the country because around 10, the military or the guerrillas would come to villages like mine and take the kids away, especially boys, to fight in the war. So although it was a good childhood, I had a lot of freedom. I played in the trees in our mountain town. The reality of the war was also something we had to tend with on a daily basis, and eventually we had to leave it. My journey to the U.S. really begins at 5 a.m. on, gosh, I don't remember the day, but in October of 1991. We boarded a bus in our village and we headed to the capital with about 13 other people from neighboring villages in Chalatenango. And we were being led by a coyota, or you could say someone who was helping us get across, a smuggler, we would, I guess, officially call it. From the bus kind of experience to the capital, we got another bus that took us to Guatemala, and then we kind of made our way into Mexico. Most of the journey to the US was walking. We walked a lot under the moonlight. We traveled in vans at times. One particular memory I have is getting into a trailer, and we had to climb into a kind of like a fake trailer compartment so that when it was inspected at the checkpoints in Mexico, they wouldn't see that people were actually there. I know that in the past few months in the news, there have been segments about trailers turning over, carrying people in Mexico. And it's both shocking to see that that's still happening, but at the same time, migration is such an act of desperation and an act of hope, search for life, that I think things like that, unfortunately, will continue to happen as people, seek life somewhere else. Thankfully, that was not our experience. We were able to eventually emerge from that trailer hours later in a different part of Mexico to continue our journey again for more walking under the moonlight. I only have vignettes, really, of the journey through Mexico. I remember another time we were in jail in a town in Mexico, somewhere in the northern part. I think that the jailer was bribed so that we could get out because we were only in there one night. This is 1991. So by that time, over 500,000 Salvadorans had already made the journey to the US or were in the process of making the journey. So there's a whole, you could say, network of stops along the way and ways of surviving the challenges on the road. Another brief vignette that I have is traveling through this town called La Ventosa, which is like the windy one or the windy area. It's a town where winds reach over 80 miles per hour. So as a skinny 9-10-year-old, I remember the people were holding on to me so that I wouldn't, get blown away, more or less. There were moments when we also had to separate into groups. My mother had to go with the adults, and there was another young person. She was about 15. The two of us went with the coyota, the woman who was guiding us, hoping that we would be reunited with our parents later that day. So these are some vignettes of what it was like. Eventually, we made it to Tijuana, to the border, which is where we crossed. And our first attempt was not successful. A border patrol came after us on their ATVs, and we ran back to the Mexico side. That's the time when I got the nickname of the rabbit, El Conejo, because I just ran back, jumping from rock to rock back to Mexico. It's what we had been told to do, so it's what I did. And we stayed in an apartment for about a week until the time was right. And about 2 a.m. on a given day, we, under the moonlight again, slowly made our way through some back trails across the border into San Isidro, where a taxi was waiting for us. And eventually we're transferred to a van. and I got to ride shotgun into Los Angeles, where I was eventually dropped off at my aunt's house. That was kind of first time in the US, first time in LA, and the end of a month-long journey from El Salvador. Yeah. I remember my first impression upon arriving in LA was getting out of the van. This is in Highland Park in Northeast LA. And I looked up and down the block where every house had the same amount of space between them, and the lawns were all the same. I remember, I don't know if I had the word, I probably didn't, but I remember this is so monotonous. Everything is so measured and calculated architecturally, the paved streets. So I was coming from a village where we did not have running water. We did not have electricity. My closest neighbor was maybe a quarter mile away. This is rural village life in El Salvador in the mountains. To move from that to Northeast LA was pretty shocking. And it was a lot to take in. But that's my first impression, and my kind of earliest memory getting out of the van was how cookie cutter, I guess, or monotonous or patterned existence was in the neighborhood. So, I knew two words of English when I came to the US: thank you and I'm sorry, because those were the only two words that my mother knew. So it's what she taught me, the two words that she had. And it was tough to kind of, start without the language in a country where all my cousins, teenagers were all speaking English, even though they could speak Spanish. The sense of childhood, in one sense, alienation or kind of trying to survive linguistically, that's tough. And that's tough for anyone who has to, of course, make it in another country. But within a few months, I started to pick up English, and that opened up whole new worlds. Yeah, so when we arrived, I was home at my aunt's for about maybe a month, 3 weeks to a month, just getting acclimated to a whole new world, getting some basic paperwork, getting my shots, getting all the basic stuff that you need in order to enter school. And we came at the end of 1991, so late October. So one of the first things that we had to do was my mom had to file some paperwork. She had lived in the US actually from 1986 to 1990, so for about 4 years. So she left me with my aunt who raised me for those 4.5 years. She went back to get me so that, as she says, I don't want to lose you to the war. But she wasn't sure when she went back whether she would be back. She wasn't sure if I would be willing to come to the US. And I initially didn't, but then, we did, given the fear of conscription into the military or the guerrillas. So when we arrived in Los Angeles, one of the first few things was she needed to file some paperwork, hoping that we would qualify for what's called TPS, temporary protected status. A war was still going on in El Salvador after all. So it was strategic to try to qualify for some kind of a temporary protected status. I know we may talk about this later, but some of my research that deals with sanctuary churches, actually, we were able to apply at that point for temporary protected status because of a lawsuit that churches had brought against the government in the 80s, because the government was denying asylum for Salvadorans throughout the 1980s. Very, very few people got asylum, even though most should have gotten asylum because of the US-funded war. But because there was such a systematic denial of asylum for Salvadorans, churches sued the government and they settled, essentially. But it meant that hundreds of thousands of people could apply for temporary protected status. So we benefited from that. And during those first few weeks in LA, it was filing paperwork and then getting me ready to go to school. I remember one of my first few days in school, I wore shorts with dress shoes and dress socks, and a classmate said, "Why are you wearing dress shoes with shorts?" And I didn't quite understand that one should not wear dress shoes with shorts. Um, again, I was coming from a village where having shoes was great. Whether they were dress shoes or tennis shoes didn't quite matter. But all of a sudden, I was within the LA scene, even in what, fourth or fifth grade. So that was a learning experience. It's a different kind of survival. How do you survive school at that age so that you fit to some degree, so that you're not an outsider, you're already a linguistic outsider, you're already an immigrant. But so how do you manage to not do things that can further alienate you? It's a learning process. But those are some of the memories that still, I guess, stay with me many years later. I'll add one more detail is in my town of Santa Rita in Chalatenango in El Salvador. Because of the war, our teachers could be absent for 3 weeks to a month, which meant the school was a patchwork of kind of going to class, sometimes not doing much, then missing 3 weeks, then going for a few weeks. Just the guerrillas could be taking care of the town or occupying the town, or the military could come and occupy the town. So there were all of these factors of the Civil War. I guess there were all these ways the Civil War affected schooling. So I hated school. I really disliked school, and I was afraid once I was here in LA, or once I was in LA, that I was going to be forced to go every day. Interestingly enough, I fell in love with school when I arrived in LA. I think it may have something to do with the fact that there was consistency, maybe a better learning environment that's not a civil war. And so I began to flourish, actually, academically, and picked up the language within a year, was moved to honors English. And at that point, education became an enjoyable, project, or enjoyable aspect of my life in the US. And it became my outlet as an immigrant kid in LA. It's difficult for me to answer exactly what initially drew me to pursue a career in academia, because I feel I backed up into it. And that would be an honest response. I went to grad school because I had been working at the US-Mexico border with churches, with NGOs, with Bishop Kikanas around migrant issues. And I had also been living for a time in a Trappist monastery where I was discerning the vocation of a Trappist monk. And it's these two experiences that both required a lot of on-the-ground work, but also a lot of intellectual work and research that in a way invited me, or kept nudging me, to return to graduate school. And it was, in one sense, I used a phrase earlier that I backed up into it. As you're getting closer and closer to completing a PhD, you say, well, I let me try to go into the world of academia. But it was something that I very much feel I was drawn into, rather than something that I set out as a goal. My goal has been, and in a way continues to be to this day, to think, to research pastoral issues, or realidad, the reality of the world, and to think theologically about that. Academia affords the space and the resources, the conversations for trying to address some of these, what I call like pastoral concerns, or the needs of humanity. So it's why I'm in it, but I am very much a scholar practitioner, or a theologian who has a foot in academia, but also a foot, I would say, in the community, in the pastoral realities that require some of the richest, deepest thinking if we're going to, I think, provide resources that are going to be helpful for addressing pastoral concerns. What initially attracted me to my areas of research, which have to do primarily with questions of theology and migration, at the core was my wrestling with God, my trying to make sense of God and of the church from the perspective of my own migrant experience and the migration experience of my Latin American communities. As an undocumented young man in LA, I wrestled a lot with God. I would say that I fought a lot with this mystery. I was trying to make sense of why I had been displaced from my village, which, although there was a war going on, I very much enjoyed. I enjoyed climbing the trees. I enjoyed playing in the rivers. As in LA, as a young man, I was trying to make sense of why would I be displaced, forcibly displaced across countries, only to be undocumented and have to live in the shadow of law enforcement, continuously afraid of getting deported. It did not make sense to me. There was a lot of frustration there that I said I, in a way, addressed to God. Of course, I did not get much of a response, but it was wrestling with that very silence, the silence of God, you could say, that I began to develop a certain familiarity with God talk, which is another way of saying theology. It's in that spiritual wrestling out of my own migrant experience that I began to find words for theology, for my own theological kind of language in relation to my experience of migration. So in time, and this spirituality became more formalized as, I guess, theological research. So I research or I work theologically with migration because of my migration experience. Yeah, they say that our biographies are part of what we do in life. It's certainly true for me. My experience of forced displacement is the place from which I do my theological work. I couldn't do otherwise. One of the aspects of my work has to do with the church sanctuary. So I research, I study, I think about churches that provide sanctuary or refuge for undocumented persons who are being persecuted by ICE and who are threatened with deportation. It's a very controversial issue right now in 2022. There isn't much going on with that, but 4 years ago, there was a lot going on with sanctuary churches. And there is nothing to say that 4 years from now, sanctuary won't be back in the news and that we will be having to figure out, can we or can we not provide sanctuary to persons in churches? And there's various answers to that kind of question. There's a legal answer, there's a political answer, but I think there's also a theological answer. So I think theologically about a church communities, church as a space, church as a site, and the capacity of these sites and these communities is that providing refuge and protection and an encounter with persons threatened with deportation. It's a practice that's been going on for over 1,500 years, and that I believe is a core pillar of what it means to be church in an age of forced displacement. So again, clearly this is work on church, on an understanding of church that is deeply interwoven with my understanding of migration, my perspective as a migrant, and with migrant communities. Other people may want to argue something different, but out of my lived reality and my people's lived reality of forced displacement, of persecution, I cannot but argue for the need for churches to stand with immigrants, to stand with forcibly displaced persons, and not in a form of charity, but really as an encounter, really a salvific encounter, I would say. As some Latin American theologians say, it is those coming south of the border that actually bear that salvation that the church needs. And we could think about that economically in terms of the country's economic needs, the labor force, But I think theologically also, migrants, forcibly displaced persons bear a certain salvation for the church in the United States. And I want to keep thinking about that. Another aspect of my work that also connects with my own experience of migration has to do with how migrant communities address the multidimensional violence that they live in. How do they find healing in their midst? An immigrant community or a person who has just recently arrived in the US may go to a doctor, a medical doctor, a hospital for certain needs, and they do. But in our Latin American culture, we also turn to healers, to curanderas, curanderos, who in our culture are also experts and carry expert knowledge on how to heal. Whether it is our personal illnesses, whether it is the traumas that we bear in our bodies, whether it is an intrapersonal conflict, we turn to healers for various needs in the community. And I research, especially here in New York City, how migrant communities and these networks of healing intersect. I am, you could say, an apprentice of a healer from Southern Mexico, from Guerrero. I accompany her to apartments where we listen to the needs of the family or the person who has sought her out, and we perform certain prayers and rituals to address those needs. In the process that I'm learning how some of these rituals are migrating from Southern Mexico, for example, how they're adapting to from the rural to the urban realities, especially when a certain herb may not be found in New York City, and maybe it was common in Southern Mexico. How certain rituals cannot be performed in urban environments because of space limitations, or perhaps we need fire, for example, and it's not safe to perform such a ritual in an apartment. So how do we translate ritual acts? How do we translate healing rites from the rural Latin American context to the urban New York City or North American context? So that's part of what I research. This translation of rituals, of healing rituals, but this whole network of curanderismo in New York City and in the US. I believe that this is actually, that there is a great need for the church to continue to tap into these knowledges that historically, because of colonialism, have been suppressed. And we are, I believe, in need of retrieving those knowledges. I will just add here one more detail about how my own personal history and my experience ties in with this research. In my village in El Salvador, when I was about 3 months old, I was dying. My mother has told me that I was losing color. I was turning green, grayish green, and she said you weren't eating anymore. So she took me to a healer in our town who performed such a ritual with eggs, with some tree branches, with some waters. And within a few hours, I regained color and I was hungry and my life was saved. I can't tell you how that works, but I am here, my mother will tell you, because this healer in our town saved my life. As I grow older and after my theological formation, with, I would say, Euro-American ways of thinking, which are very rich, and I am very deeply thankful for them, I also increasingly turn to the knowledges of my own people, of my own culture, that are also life-giving. And I'm trying to make theological sense of them and to think about them in relation to other forms of theological knowledge that we have and that perhaps are too dominant in Catholicism and in Christianity. So that's another personal entree into the research that I do now on healing practices, the fact that my life was saved by a healer when I was a baby. So I applied for an IACS fellowship because I've been following the Institute of Advanced Catholic Studies for a few years through social media, but I was not clear on how my particular work with migrant communities could intersect with the Institute. In the recent past, the Institute has begun a major project on Guadalupe. And interestingly enough, that to me communicated, there's this major project on Guadalupe. I said it gave me a different understanding perhaps, or a different perspective of what the Institute may be about. And I began to see the possibility of my work perhaps fitting in with the vision and mission of the Institute. So when I saw the fellowship application, and especially a line in the description of the fellowship that said they were interested in the evolving tradition of Catholic thought, I thought, well, this is what I do. I am both deeply rooted in the Catholic intellectual traditions, in Catholic thought, it's my formation, but I'm also very interested in expanding that and stretching that, given my social, cultural, historical location. So the fellowship seemed to invite that kind of thinking, or those kinds of approaches, where it's both deeply rooted in the traditions that constitute, the Catholicity of the Church or of the Roman Catholic tradition, but in relation to all kinds of other pressing concerns, fields of knowledge, or ways of expanding and moving forward Catholicism or Catholicity. So I applied, and I am very happy that there was a resonance between my work and the vision of the Institute. The fellowship will provide me with precious time for continuing to investigate how the knowledge and the wisdom of healers who accompany migrant communities in the US can help us reimagine church or churches as sites for multidimensional healing. Let me give you just a brief example or how I think about this. The Latin American communities in the United States, in one sense, live in two parallel tracks. On the one hand, we have liturgy. We have the sacramental life, which exists within church context and in relation to Catholicism. But then we may have these encounters, or these ways that we turn to curanderismo, or healers that I mentioned earlier. But these two don't necessarily intersect, quite the opposite. If you were to tell a priest or mention that you also may be turning to traditional healing practices from Latin America, this will raise suspicion. So I am interested in both investigating further ways that we can reimagine churches as sites of healing, especially in light of Pope Francis's ongoing call for the church to think of itself as a field hospital. He emphasizes over and over since his papacy in 2013 began, what would it look like for the church to be a field hospital? And he keeps emphasizing we need to learn how to heal, learn how to heal, learn how to heal. Well, much of the knowledge I want to say may reside within communities that the church itself marginalizes. So the fellowship is going to give me precious time to continue to expand and deepen the research that I am already doing through my ethnographic work in New York City with healing communities and networks of healers. And I hope to expand that also to learn from how some faith communities in Los Angeles may already be engaging in this work. Additionally, though, during the fellowship time, I will be gathering and convening scholars and practitioners from various fields of study for discussions and conversations on healing, but from the expertises that go beyond theology. So, for example, here in New York, before the pandemic, every Thursday night, I would go to the basement of a Jesuit parish where we would engage in embodied performances of the daily life of migrant communities. So we would use the tradition of theater of the oppressed, which is popular in Latin America and South America, especially in context of war and violence. We would use theater of the oppressed to perform, for example, what is it like being in front of a judge when you have to go for a court hearing for your immigration case? So everyone in this basement, on Thursday nights would have a role. Someone would play the judge. Someone would play a lawyer. Someone would be a witness. Someone would be an accompanier of the person who was going there, where their future was going to be decided. And we would get into place and freeze. So there were kind of still image of a scene. And we would embody that. And then we would process. What did that feel like? What was your body telling you? And in the shared processing of these toxic stresses of living without documents, without legal status in the US, in the processing and in the sharing, we would find ways of bearing, I would say, each other's health, bearing with each other in the struggle, in solidarity, perhaps. As I look back at those Thursdays in the basement of the Jesuit church, I realized that those simple performances were pretty profound for addressing the embodied toxic stress that persons carry as immigrants in this country. I want to think of how do we take the knowledge and the wisdom of theater of the oppressed, of the performing arts, of dance therapy or movement therapy, ways of knowledge and ways of knowing that are attuned to the body. How do we take trauma studies, which more and more intersect with theology? How do we take liturgy and sacramental theology? And how do we think at that nexus where it may be possible to imagine church otherwise, where it may be possible to imagine faith communities as these containers capable of holding each other in the midst of ongoing violence, in the midst of ongoing social ills and social stressors. But how do we imagine these ecclesial communities as bearers of health? And I'm using health here in a broad sense, more than perhaps medical Western medicine, in that fullness of shalom, to use the Hebrew word, in the fullness of peace, in the fullness of salvation. This whole category of salvation, of course, is crucial for how we think of what the church is. So I want to think of the connection between health and salvation during this time in the fellowship in relation to these various disciplines. So I'll be gathering scholars, practitioners for conversations on healing and how that may be scalable in faith communities. I believe that my project is important because it places two major needs, two major categories at play, both the immigrant community in the United States and the fact that we are increasingly an immigrant church in this country. We are a church comprised of immigrants at the root, and the fact that we live in a society with deep, deep wounds in a society profoundly marked by violence. I want to put and place immigrant communities at the heart of the church and what it means to be church. And I want to think about what these communities, my communities, need from the church and what they bring to the church. Because as I think about the category of healing in relation to marginalized communities, communities that the church itself marginalizes, it's not simply that the church has something of healing to offer immigrant communities. In fact, it may be the opposite, that it is migrant communities and communities marked by the experience of displacement, of migration, of violence, and their profound spiritualities and ways of survival that perhaps has something to offer the institutional church as it becomes a church more attuned to what Pope Francis is calling it to be, a field hospital that knows how to heal. I think part of that, though, means that the church itself must first attend to its own wounds and its own capacity to wound. And somehow in that encounter of the wounded ones of history, the persecuted, the oppressed, the poor, broadly speaking, it is in that encounter of the poor and the church, or migrants and the church, that I think there is something profoundly healing that takes place. So this is, I think this is the focus that my project brings for rethinking church in an age of ongoing forced displacement that is not going away. My project has the potential real-world implications of helping us envision and transform what it means to be a church in the United States that is attuned to healing and to migrant communities. Persons who endure migration often leave contexts of war, endure a warlike journey, and survive with creative agency in the United States in the midst of the state's persecution of their life. I want to bring that creative agency of immigrant communities, that knowledge of survival that they bear, and that healing wisdom that is literally in their bodies, in their culture. I want to think with that and bring that to the church. And I want to see how we can scale that up. In the United States, there are about 17,000 Roman Catholic parishes. Can you imagine if even a fraction of the 17,000 or so Roman Catholic parishes were to make social healing and healing in relation to communal violence or persecution a central category for what it meant to be a parish, what it meant to be a faith community? I think it would transform Roman Catholicism in the US. It would force us to think not only in terms of our theological histories, but in relation to all kinds of fields of knowledge, and in relation to, as I already said, the knowledges that migrant communities themselves have for the church. So the real world implications of my research is about transforming the church, perhaps one small faith community at a time. But there are ways that this is already happening. And I want to highlight how that is already happening. And I want to think bigger about that. And I want to gather people at the table to discuss ways that that may be scalable beyond any given faith community. It is my understanding that the Institute of Advanced Catholic Studies seeks to further and literally advance the Catholic intellectual tradition. as I think about my work and the work of new generations of scholars and theologians that are located both deeply within the Catholic tradition, but also deeply thinking out of it or with it or beyond it or stretching it, I think the Institute is genuinely positioning itself to address some of the most urgent concerns of this country, of the church, of humanity, and just thinking about my own work with healing and migration. This is not going away. In the past 10 years, forcibly displaced persons have doubled around the world, over 80 million, now close to 90 million. We need to figure out how we respond as church, as people of faith, as scholars, as activists, to these wounds of humanity. And I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to be able to think deep about this interdisciplinary work that requires me to do field work, that requires me to have conversations across disciplines, if there's going to be a more robust response to this massive, massive crisis of ongoing displacement around the world. I do think the church has a lot to contribute. I do think theology has a lot to contribute, but no one field can respond to the enormous nature of the challenges before us. And centers like the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies give scholars the place for this exploration. And so I just want to commend the vision that is guiding them, and be very thankful for the opportunity for my own research. My name is Leo Guardado. I am an assistant professor at Fordham University in New York City.